Wait for it. Here we go. All right. Let's talk about how we control the secretions of the pituitary gland. In particular, as we look at the pituitary gland, it's not always going to be making secretions. So we'll have an on-off function of our pituitary gland. In particular, the hypothalamus is going to help to control the anterior and posterior pituitary gland, and also the cerebrum as a whole. So it's where our brain is monitoring blood chemistry and blood conditions. Our hypothalamus could potentially trigger the release of ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and that's typically going to be a stress response hormone. During pregnancy, the hypothalamus is going to monitor blood chemistry and go, hey, whoa, we're pregnant, and trigger the release of prolactin so that the woman's breasts are getting ready to lactate and supply milk to the newborn child. As we're looking at the posterior pituitary gland. So those two examples were of the anterior pituitary gland, focusing on that anterior pituitary gland. As we focus on the posterior pituitary gland, we have neuroendocrine reflexes. And when we say neuroendocrine reflexes, that means that there's going to be a lot more neurons involved with directly monitoring and controlling the posterior pituitary gland. So we have osmoreceptors. When we think of an osmoreceptor, this is going to be a chemical that measures the osmolarity or the water concentration of the bloodstream. So we have osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus that will then trigger the release of antidiuretic hormone when there's an increase in blood osmolarity. In other words, if our blood is getting too salty, we're going to release antidiuretic hormones so that we retain water. If an infant is suckling, there's going to be a lot of physical stimulation of the woman's areola by that infant's mouth, and that triggers the hypothalamus to release oxytocin into the woman's bloodstream so that there can be letdown of milk. And this is a very quick response. It's also worth emphasizing that we as human beings, we're just all a bunch of Pavlovian dogs. And what do I mean by that? We can be trained to have secondary stimuli initiate the response of the primary stimuli. So if you spend any amount of time talking to moms, a lot of moms will mention how that they've just been trained to the point, subconsciously trained to the point that when they hear their infant cry, they immediately are going to start having the oxytocin released and have the milk let down, because infant crying has so strongly associated in their bodies with breastfeeding and then the release of the oxytocin. I find stuff like that to be absolutely fascinating. So as we look at some negative feedback controls that affect the pituitary gland, remember, negative feedback is when the response is opposite of the stimulus. So these negative feedbacks help to maintain homeostasis. A good example is thyroid releasing hormone and thyroid stimulating hormone. We will release the hypothalamus thyroid releasing hormone, which goes to the anterior pituitary gland. Thyroid releasing hormone is then going to go cause the hypothalamus to release thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone will then cause us to release more thyroid hormone. However, thyroid hormone is going to go to the target organs, do its job, but it also goes back up to the brain and inhibits thyroid releasing and thyroid stimulating hormone from being released from the brain. So we have this push and pull, this give and take, so we can maintain homeostasis in our bodies. We also can have positive feedback in our bodies. And this is when the response is the same as the stimulus. This is an amplification of a signal. So, for example, let's say the baby is growing inside of the mother's womb. And as the baby is growing larger, the baby's head will push down into the cervix of the mother's uterus. That's going to cause stretching. That stretching is going to send a response to the hypothalamus. In response to that stress, the stretching of the smooth muscle of the uterus, the hypothalamus will be triggering the posterior pituitary gland to release oxytocin. That oxytocin will then, actually, here's the posterior pituitary right there, will then come from the posterior pituitary gland into the bloodstream and go to the uterus. At the uterus, oxytocin is going to cause more contractions. More contractions is going to cause the cervix to stretch out even more. More stretching release means more stretch response, means more oxytocin. More oxytocin means more contractions, which means more stretching, which means more stretch response. You get the idea. It's an amplifying signal. So how do we stop this signal? To break the cycle, the woman needs to give birth. And then the uterus stops being stretched out. As we look at growth hormone within the human body, growth hormone, sometimes referred to as HGH, human growth hormone, is going to affect a lot of body tissues, in particular cartilage, bone, muscle, and fat. To a lesser degree, the integumentary system, because if we have all of these other tissue types expanding and growing, we're also going to need to have more skin to cover the body as we have an increase in volume. So human growth hormone is going to cause these other tissues of the body to expand or proliferate. Human growth hormone or growth hormone will also go to the liver and cause growth stimulants to be released from the liver. Insulin-like growth factors, IGFs, and somatomedians, IGF-2s, will be released, and they are going to then travel around the body and affect a wide variety of tissues. Growth hormone in particular has an interesting half-life. So when we think of hormonal half-life, that's the amount of time it takes for half of the hormone to be released from the bloodstream. Most of you had to take a chemistry class as a prerequisite to get into here, into anatomy and physiology, and you probably learned about half-life in the context of radioactive decay, of radioactive isotopes, and the production of alpha, beta, and gamma particles. In this context, within human anatomy and physiology, we're not talking about the amount of time it takes for half of the isotope to decompose. We're talking about the amount of time it takes for half of the chemical to be eliminated from the body. So growth hormone has a half-life of 6 to 20 minutes. It's a relatively short half-life. This hormone is water-soluble and can be easily urinated out of the body and eliminated from the bodies. And when we look at IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor, it has a half-life of about 20 hours. This hormone is much more difficult to remove from the body. As we're looking at these other chemicals being produced or other things that are controlled, as we're looking by the liver is going to have more protein synthesis in response to growth hormone. So we're going to have more amino acids absorbed into the cells, and then as we have more amino acids being absorbed into the cells, that is going to be used to transcribe proteins in our bodies and inhibit protein catabolism. Why would we want to have more protein synthesis? We want more protein synthesis because if we're trying to grow more cells in our bodies, those cells need proteins to function, in particular enzymes, to regulate the chemical reactions of those cells. We're also going to have increased lipid metabolism. We're going to have adipocytes catabolizing fats. So we find that we are going to have fats being preferentially used as a source of energy as opposed to proteins. This is going to go hand in hand with increasing the protein synthesis. When we increase protein synthesis, we want to decrease protein digestion. We're also going to have effects on carbohydrate metabolism. These chemicals, these stimulants are going to have a glucose-sparing effect. In particular, they're going to mobilize fatty acids from lipids as a source of fuel. This is going to free extra glucose for the brain, which in turn is going to make it so that our brain can function more appropriately, and it's also going to stimulate glucose secretion by the liver. So we're going to have the liver breaking apart glycogen and releasing that stored carbohydrate into the body. And then as we look at electrolyte balances, the sodium, potassium, and chloride ions and calcium ions are all going to be increased in the bodies. So sodium, potassium, and chloride are going to be preferentially retained in the kidney, so we won't urinate out as many of those ions. And then when we think of calcium, we're going to have increased calcium absorption in the intestines so that we can get more dietary calcium into our bodies. All of these functions, all of these collectively, are going to function so that we can have increased growth of our muscle and bone tissues, which is going to be primarily related to what growth hormone is all about. As we look at our skeletal tissues, growth hormone is going to cause bones to thicken and become stronger and denser. This happens primarily during childhood and early adolescence. As we think of growth hormone, we have lots of secretion during the first 2 hours of sleep. In other words, sleep helps to heal your body. If you get lots of sleep, you have more growth hormone and you have more repair of your muscular and skeletal tissues. This is one of the reasons why athletes who skip bedtime typically have terrible performance. If you work out really hard during the day, but you don't sleep at night, you're not really gaining that much from your workout. Growth hormone also can peak in response to vigorous exercise. In particular, vigorous exercise is known to cause minor tearing of skeletal muscle tissues and cause very, very minor fracturing of compact bone tissue. So we'll have a peak of growth hormone to help compensate for these damaging effects that occur and also to help mobilize more glucose for energy sources. As we look at growth hormone, it can be activated by ghrelin. Ghrelin is a hormone we're not going to focus on very much. We just don't have the time. It's a hormone of hunger. So when we have an empty stomach, we are going to release ghrelin, the hormone of hunger. As we look at growth hormone, its levels decline or decrease as we age. Our ability to repair tissues and respond to exercise slowly declines as we age. So as we look at in adolescence, we're going to have about 6 nanograms of growth hormone per milliliter of blood when we're a teenager, and that declines to about 1.5 nanograms per milligram. The typo, that should be per milliliter of blood in our old age. So what does this mean? As we age, we have a harder time synthesizing proteins. We have a harder time repairing damaged tissues. As we get to the age of 30, so young adult, I'll still say young adulthood. We're about 10% bone, 3% muscle, 20% fat. But as we continue to age and get to the age of 75, we're at about 8% bone, 15% muscle, and a dramatic increase in the adipose content, 40% fat. Remember, growth hormone promotes the catabolism of lipids and has a protein sparing effect. If we look at the pineal gland, so we're shifting gears now to a completely different gland of the body. We've been focusing on the pituitary gland because, well, there's a lot on the pituitary gland. So now we're going to shift gears. Now we're going to focus on the pineal gland. Our pineal gland is located on the posterior of the diencephalon, directly beneath this big bridge, that corpus callosum. The pineal gland is sometimes referred to as the epithalamus by some individuals. Now, this pineal gland is going to be primarily associated with melatonin. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. When we're younger, the pineal gland is going to start shrinking. And as this pineal gland shrinks, we are going to find that its function will decline. In young children, the pineal gland is very large. When we hit puberty, it starts to shrink. By the end of puberty, it's lost 3/4 of its volume, and it's very, very hard to find in adult brains during a cadaver dissection. As we think and as we look at melatonin, melatonin is going to be associated with regulating our circadian rhythms, our ability to respond to light and dark, daytime and nighttime, and sleep when it's at nighttime. This fact that the pineal gland involutes or shrinks as we age is hypothesized to be one of the reasons why, as we get older and older, particularly when we reach the geriatric years, a lot of individuals that are more aged have a very difficult time getting good sleep at night. And if they do fall asleep, it's not good sleep. And a lot of times they wake up at 3 a.m., 4 a.m. in the morning. That's very common. And they have a habit of falling asleep while it's still daylight out, 6 p.m., 7 p.m. at night. This can be casually linked to this involution of the pineal gland. So what happens with our pineal gland? Our pineal gland is going to respond to light. So we can have warm lights and cool lights. Warm lights are going to be typically more of have more red wavelengths in them, or shorter or longer wavelength of the visible spectrum. Cool light is going to have more blue wavelengths, or more of the shorter wavelengths of the visible spectrum. And these different kinds of light can help to regulate our circadian rhythms. It is worth mentioning, and this is not very well established, but there's some very brief evidence to suggest that the pineal gland is going to influence the timing of puberty in human beings. This is an area of active research. Right now, what I really want to emphasize for you with the pineal gland is melatonin and circadian rhythms. So as we're looking at melatonin levels in the body, if we don't get enough daylight or enough cool light or short frequency light, we may end up suffering from a dramatic lack of melatonin, which may cause seasonal affective disorder, aka SAD, being depressed in the winter because you never see the sunshine. I know that for me in particular, that's a problem. If I never see the sun during wintertime, I tend to be kind of sad about that. So how can you combat this issue? You can have 2 to 3 hours a day sunlight, if possible. I know for me in particular, I intentionally put my office desk in my office directly in front of my window to maximize sunlight exposure. But what if you live in Alaska or in the far northern latitudes and it's dark 24 hours a day? You can have these bright, cool lights to help give you those short frequency, high energy wavelengths that you need to simulate sunlight. It's known as the happy light. And you can have full spectrum light bulbs. For me in particular, when I wake up in the morning, I like to go down to my kitchen and I have a couple really bright, cool lights that I turn on to help me wake up in the morning because I have to get up really early in the morning to get to work on time. So what else can you do? You can maximize blue light exposure early in the morning, and you can minimize blue light exposure late at night to help keep your cycle on your circadian rhythm on cycle. So something that a lot of people struggle with right now is staring at their little rectangles, their little devices at night. And as you're staring at these smartphones at night, the blue light from the smartphone screens can cause the brain to not release enough melatonin. Blue light frequencies from smartphones will cause insomnia. This is one of the reasons why you probably noticed that you can fall asleep at night when you're feeling sleepy, but then you turn on a movie, you start staring at the computer screen, and all of a sudden you can stay awake for 2 to 3 to 4 more hours while you're staring at that computer screen. For me in particular, it's my laptop. If I get on my laptop at night, I can stay awake until 1 a.m. in the morning, no problem. And then the next day I really regret it. Why do I really regret it the next day? Because lack of sleep causes my body to build up neurotoxins, which makes it even harder for me to sleep. Lack of sleep is going to make it more difficult for me to learn. My brain just doesn't function as well when I'm in a sleep deprivation state. And not only is it harder to learn, it's also I'm going to have that impaired memory. So the things that I have learned, I'm going to have a harder time to recall. And when I have a lack of sleep, generally speaking, I feel pretty cruddy. I am going to have more symptoms of depression that are going to be associated with lack of sleep. And there's some more causal things that have been found. These are areas that need more research to establish them, but it's been found that blue light and the lack of sleep associated with blue light may potentially cause an increase in cancers, may potentially cause an increase in cataracts, and may potentially damage the retina of the eye. These last three that I mentioned at the bottom are not as well established. The other ones that I had mentioned on the top of the screen are much more supported by the data. So what could you do? Get good sleep. Well, first, don't stare at any electronic devices for at least 1 hour before you want to go to bed. And I know this is easier said than done. I know for me in particular, my wife and I, we like to Netflix and veg before we go to bed at night. After we get the kids in bed, it's just easy to go and chill out for a while we watch a movie. So if you are going to Netflix and veg, or just chill out and watch a movie on your device, use a blue light filter, or a red screen filter, I should say, on your phone, which tints your phone or your screen to be more towards the red end of the spectrum. That's all we have for this recording. As always, class, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to shoot me an email or post them on the class discussion board, and happy studies.